He was a wealthy Texas businessman, as well as a loving and devoted father.
Greg was in the IT business and had been very successful.
He was an awesome dad. He was caring, loving, very protective.
But he couldn't protect his family from a deadly home invasion.
He was shot in the head.
There was a great deal of blood.
How am I going to tell my daughter her dad is dead?
And in the course of their investigation, detectives will untangle a web of lies to reveal a horrific act of betrayal.
The more deeply they delved, the more interesting that story became. The motive was money. Tried and true, age-old money.
October 13th, 2011. It's a quiet morning in the affluent suburb of Keller, Texas, when police receive a frantic call from 42-year-old Michelle Williams.
What's going on? My husband was shot. Somebody was in the house. Like, he's really sad. He was shot in the head. Your husband was shot in the head?
It was very noisy, and she was screaming that an intruder had come into the home, and police, of course, were dispatched immediately. Their first concern was to get in there and make sure that nobody else was in the house and ensure everyone's safe.
Officers search the home, but there is no sign of the intruder. In the bedroom, they find Michelle's husband, 40-year-old Greg Williams, shot to death.
Greg was actually found on his bed and had a gunshot wound to his head.
Greg had been shot in the temple region. There was a great deal of blood.
Michelle says the shooter was a masked man who broke in while they were asleep.
She had been asleep on the couch with their young daughter, Michaela, who was 4 at the time. She heard a noise. She rushed into the bedroom. She saw a person dressed in black, and that person struck her in the face, that she briefly lost consciousness. When she awoke, she realized that her husband had been shot in the head.
At first glance, it appears to be an attempted robbery gone wrong. But investigators will soon realize there is much more to this case than meets the eye. Greg Williams was born in Dallas, Texas on March 24, 1971, to a modest middle-class family.
His father was an electrician, and his mother worked retail jobs. It was not really a happy childhood. I mean, every family fights about money, but he had a very good upbringing. You know, his parents did not divorce until he was an adult.
His family's difficulties seemed to instill a sense of ambition that would serve Greg well as he embarked on a career of his own.
He was driven, he was focused, he would get upset if something wasn't done right. He would work 8 to 12 to 14 hours a day sometimes.
Greg met the woman who would become his first wife at a party in 1993. And it wasn't long before they started a family of their own.
He had several different jobs. When I met him, he was teaching at a martial arts school in Irving. We bought our first house, was his house that his parents owned when he was born. And our daughter was born in that house. He was an awesome dad. He was caring, loving, very protective.
He was a provider, so his first and foremost priority was his job and providing for his children. One thing that I remember most about my dad is that whenever he made a promise to be somewhere or to do something, he always went through with that promise.
After working hard for several different employers, Greg finally decided to go into business for himself with an information technology company.
I worked full-time and we had our kids, and he slowly just built it up, and then it just finally boomed. I mean, he got one major client, and then that client told another client. It took him about 8 to 10 years to build this company where he wanted it.
But success would come at the cost of his marriage.
Right at the end of 2002, we split up. We just couldn't make it work. We're just two different people. I am a homebody. He likes going places. We got a divorce. We would stay very involved in each other's lives. I would help him pick up some computer parts he needed because it was right around the corner from my office. We had an open custody arrangement, and we stayed in the same town for a long time, so it was very easy.
Greg focused on his burgeoning business and his daughter. But in 2004, he would get another chance at love when he met a successful woman online. Michelle Zahn was 2 years older than Greg and already had 3 children of her own. The two found they had much in common.
She had made her own way in life. She was hardworking, charismatic, and of course I think that's probably one of the things that drew Greg to her. She was very much a person that had to take care of herself and take care of those that she loved. Their relationship seemed to be happy and full of energy. They seemed to be very much in love.
It didn't take long for their relationship to blossom.
They dated for a while, and then he introduced me and my stepmother, and then she moved in. So I had been living with her from the time I was 6 years old. My dad was always spoiling her, getting her things that she wanted. He invested in a business for her, a frozen yogurt business, and she helped with his business, and everything seemed fine.
In 2007, Michelle gave Greg another daughter, Michaela. They decided to get married the following year.
I thought it was really cool having a little sister. Now I had someone else I could help take care of and love on and play with.
When he married Michelle, his business had already taken off. They had a great relationship and they were happy. They would go on cruises. They would have parties and get-togethers.
He was probably making in the range of $800,000 a year. They lived in a very nice house, about a 5,000 square foot home, but they had leased that property and actually were in the process of purchasing a new home in the range of about $4.5 million home.
But just as they were about to close the deal, a masked gunman took everything from the Williams family, and Texas police are determined to catch them. Coming up, was it a robbery gone wrong or something far worse?
He has quite a few not so good friends.
Police in Keller, Texas, are investigating the murder of 40-year-old technology mogul Greg Williams, shot by an intruder during an apparent break-in. The masked man struck Greg's wife, Michelle, as he fled the scene, but their daughter, Michaela, was left unharmed.
It was obviously a fresh bruise. There was subcutaneous bleeding under the skin. She was hit by the intruder with a wrench. EMT people arrived at the scene. They checked her out. They also made sure that Michaela was okay. Their job was pretty limited because Greg was obviously deceased at that time.
As detectives searched the bedroom, they immediately noticed several clues.
There was a .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun that was lying by the bed. There was a wrench lying by the bed, and there was some damage to the doors that led from the bedroom out onto the patio or the pool area outside. There was a screwdriver lying another 10 or 15 feet from the door.
It seemed as though the screwdriver was used to enter that door.
Initially, it looks like a robbery, but the shooter didn't attempt to steal anything from the house.
There was no jewelry or personal property that was taken. The gun that was found next to the bed belonged to Greg. Obviously, it was an affluent neighborhood. They were people that, if you knew them by reputation, that had some money there. They had, my recollection is, about $20,000 there in the home.
It also appears that the killer was exceptionally careful. When police dust for fingerprints, they quickly discover there aren't any.
If you don't find the murderer's fingerprints, that can be all kinds of reasons. If nothing else, they're wearing gloves. But you find fingerprints of a 4-year-old. You find fingerprints of the victim. You find fingerprints of the wife that lives there. But everything was very, very, very cleaned up, straightened up, wiped clean. There were no fingerprints whatsoever.
As the investigation continues, detectives realize this crime scene isn't everything it appears to be.
More and more things seemed curious. They recovered some glass outside, and the glass was out on the patio. Normally, you would think that if someone breaks in, the glass goes into the room, not outside the room.
The glass was on the wrong side of the door. The way the gun and wrench were positioned during that scene staged.
The question is, why? After Michelle receives medical treatment, detectives sit down with her to make sense of the conflicting evidence.
Try to help me. Kind of just run over the store with you again. Maybe you can fill in any gaps for me. Okay.
I heard a noise, and I get up.
This was what time, you think?
4 something.
Okay.
I didn't get past the bedroom door. I opened it, and I got hit by, I still don't know what. I could see it was a male in dark stuff, dark clothing, but I couldn't tell you really any details about that.
He ran out the door. What did you call to him?
I crawled over to Greg, and I grabbed a hold of his hand, and I felt blood run down the bed. And so I called 911, and while I was calling 911, I ran out there to check on Michaela.
When police ask Michelle why she and Michaela were sleeping on the couch, she says they moved their daughter to the living room after she fell down the stairs in the middle of the night.
I know it's personal, but I have to ask. No prior history with marital problems, no problem with debts or anything like that?
No, money's not a problem. Relationship's not a problem.
Okay.
Everything was good until the middle of the night. Everything was good.
According to Michelle, she and Greg had never been happier. In fact, they were closing on their new house the very next day.
The significance of that would seem to be that at least one of the two people believed that the marriage was stable. I mean, if people are having difficulty, they're not making plans to go plunk down a lot of money for a $4.5 million home.
However, Michelle does fear that her husband may have made some dangerous enemies.
Anybody you think might have done it?
He has quite a few not so good friends that I've met, drug dealers and bad people. He's kind of like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde.
As she was talking, she revealed some personal facts about Greg. He was very much into physical fitness. He was a bodybuilder and a person of some significant build and musculature. She revealed that he was heavily into the use of steroids, which, of course, can be used in bodybuilding and can also have significant side effects.
Greg bought steroids from somebody, I don't know who, but he had steroids in the refrigerator in our bedroom.
And what? Refrigerator?
In the refrigerator in our master closet. He keeps that very private and away from me and Michaela.
From the evidence police have gathered so far, it looks like Michelle could be right.
There were anabolic steroids found at the scene where Greg's body was, and he had apparently been obtaining those steroids illegally. There was some concern that maybe his involvement with people either dealing or distributing anabolic steroids might have had something to do with Greg's death.
Coming up, did Greg's secret get him killed? Or did someone just try to make it look that way?
They're giving me information about the stuff on the scene that doesn't match the story.
While detectives continue their investigation into the murder of millionaire Greg Williams, his ex-wife and daughter are just finding out what happened.
I got a phone call from his brother, bawling, telling me that Greg was gone. And I don't remember too much after that for a few minutes. It was so hard. All I could think about is, how am I going to tell my daughter her dad is dead?
I was 12. I was daddy's little girl, daddy's little princess, and I did anything and everything I could to make my dad happy. I was in a lot of shock, and then it was sadness, depression, and all that.
There were some thoughts that perhaps an intruder was related to dealings with anabolic steroids, money that was owed either to Greg or by Greg. These were all ideas that were explored.
His ex-wife confirms that Greg sometimes used steroids, but doesn't believe it could have had anything to do with his death.
I knew he was taking steroids. He'd probably been doing them about 5 years. Before the business got busy, he would do competitions like over in Prague, kickboxing, different types of martial arts. He always liked to stay in shape. I don't think Greg got involved with the wrong people. Greg would never bring that into his life and put his children at risk.
Investigators speak to everyone who knew Greg and canvass the neighborhood searching for any possible leads.
There was no evidence shown that somebody, as they did this canvass, had seen or heard or filmed any sort of vehicle or any person that didn't belong in the neighborhood, particularly at 4:30 in the morning. But this was an affluent neighborhood, so you would imagine, and there were, in fact, some security cameras mounted on various houses and recorded cars that came in through the security gate.
Detectives searched the security tapes looking for any suspicious vehicles, but there was no trace of the intruder.
The only car that had come in during the period of time in question was traced to belong to the newspaper deliverer.
In fact, the more police look at the evidence, the more they begin to doubt that a break-in even occurred.
Michelle's story that morning began to break down after a bit of time as some of the facts became obviously inconsistent.
There's some details I really need to go over with them. They're giving me information about the stuff on the scene just doesn't match the story, so I'm trying to find out, for sure what happened here. That's my job. You had your gates dummy locked, which means there's no way that anybody would have got in or out of the backyard. They found some pry marks, but the only way those pry marks could have been put on that door, the door would have been open, not closed when it was done. So the question is, how did someone access the house? You have to be honest with me and tell me anything else that's going on, because basically what information we're getting right now doesn't match up with the scene. Okay?
I'm telling you what I know.
Michelle sticks to her story, but during questioning, police float another theory to explain how Greg was killed under such mysterious circumstances.
Suicide, if under some circumstances of stress, could be a reasonable way, when she was the only one in the home, to explain how he was dead and she didn't do it.
As we did that, picked the case apart, it seemed as though the evidence supported that Greg indeed killed himself.
What I recall from the crime scene pictures is that the pistol was right there and the cartridge case was right beside it.
At the time of Greg's death, there was a lot going on in his life. There were some concerns that his business was starting to falter, or that just the couple had overextended themselves financially. Also, there was some concern about Greg's use of anabolic steroids and how that might have affected his mental health.
Had side effects from the steroids he was using driven Greg to take his own life?
His demeanor hadn't changed, nothing out of the ordinary recently that would lead you to believe. And again, anything.
Yeah, lately he's been more aggravated and yelling, and Steve's gotten the really bad end of him.
You got to be honest with me here, because it does change things. Did Greg injure himself and you tried to cover it up?
No, he did not hurt himself.
And you don't have a clue about how that stuff got in those positions by the door or anything like that then?
No, I have no clue.
But if there was no intruder, as investigators believe, and Greg didn't kill himself, they're left with only one other possibility.
The only other thing that could have happened, honestly, could have happened, is if you might have done it.
I did not hurt my husband, and he did not hurt himself.
Okay.
There was a man in my house.
Coming up, as detectives continue to press Michelle, her story changes once again.
I knew I wasn't going to leave here without being able to tell the truth.
Detectives are grilling 42-year-old Michelle Williams about the details of her husband's death. Her story about an intruder doesn't match the evidence, and they want to know why she's hiding the truth.
I don't know whether police believed the intruder story from the beginning. There are parts of that story that, if you look closely, perhaps don't feel right. And so in most cases where someone is killed in their home, the spouse is responsible.
You know what happened. So you need to tell me. I mean, this is it. I don't, we're getting the wits in.
With police chipping away at her story, Michelle finally appears to come clean.
You've got to be honest with me, Michelle. If he did it and you covered it up, just tell me.
He does.
Huh?
He does.
Okay. You want to tell me the story, what really happened now?
Michelle indicated that, well, it really was not an intruder, that she had made up the story because her husband, who was situationally depressed from time to time, killed himself.
She explained that in order to make it look like an intruder had entered the home, that she had rearranged some items, that she had placed the screwdriver where it was so that it would look as though someone had entered the door. Also, she cleaned up the scene some so that it would not be easily determined that Greg had killed himself.
The rationale that we got was that she didn't want her child to know.
I couldn't let her know that. There's blood everywhere. I took some Clorox wipes, and I wiped the gun with the blanket that he had right there. And I set it down, and I had to figure out what the hell to do at that point.
You put the gun by the door?
I opened the door and I put the gun by the door. Because if it was sitting by him, of course it would.
Michelle explains that she broke the glass, then arranged the items in the room to make it look like a burglary.
In order to make some sense, I had to have an injury. I was so panicked. And I just set myself.
What's that, wrench?
It's a wrench. I went back and opened the back door, and while there was I was calling 911 and hoped that somebody could still keep him alive, but I knew he wouldn't make it.
But Michelle acknowledges that she had another reason for covering up Greg's suicide as well.
Michelle had a life insurance policy on Greg Williams for $850,000. But it had a suicide clause. So if he commits suicide, she cannot collect the life insurance.
Michelle talked about Greg having periods of extreme depression, and really it was something they kept from the outside world.
After finishing her interrogation, detectives charged Michelle with evidence tampering.
Because it is a criminal offense, I have to read you your rights and explain those to you first. Okay? You're going home.
I knew I wasn't going to leave here without being at the
She ultimately leaves the police station that day, having signed a statement indicating that he had killed himself.
However, Greg's loved ones don't believe Michelle's new story any more than the first.
The story of a suicide never resonated with anybody. Nobody thought that Greg's personality indicated a suicide.
He had a friend the year before, December 20th, kill himself. And I have only seen Greg cry maybe twice, and that was one of them. He took Taylor on his lap, and he says, "Do not ever do that. That is the most selfish thing you can do to the people that you leave." There was no way he committed suicide whatsoever. I would bet my life on it.
In fact, they're convinced Michelle is the one who murdered Greg, and that she did it for the money.
The police began talking to people that knew more about Michelle's personal life. And the more deeply they delved into that, the more interesting that story became.
For a long time, she was nice to me, but something deep down told me that there was something wrong and that I shouldn't trust her.
I saw the evil in her in the very first time I met her.
Coming up, did Michelle decide to cash in her husband's fortune?
From my experience, when someone wants to commit suicide, they typically don't want to miss. So you put the muzzle of the firearm a little bit closer.
After hours of interrogation, Michelle Williams has confessed, saying she covered up her husband's suicide. But investigators still think she's holding out on them. And the medical examiner's autopsy seems to confirm their suspicions.
We have a very good medical examiner's office in Tarrant County, and the most significant finding was the nature of the wound itself. This was not a contact wound. When you put a gun up to your head like this, it does different things, and the evidence that is left behind can tell you a lot. One of the things that it can tell you is the range from which the shot was fired, and that's important in a case like this.
Based on the state's expert, the gun was an unnaturally far distance from Greg's head whenever it was discharged.
I did the distance determination testing and determined that it was further than 6 inches, but closer than 24 inches. That would have put his arm in a peculiar position, extended out and holding the pistol in a manner a little difficult to shoot himself in the temple.
The report confirms that Greg did not kill himself. He was murdered.
What was wrong with Michelle's story was that it was not true. On October the 13th, Greg's death was officially ruled a homicide by the medical examiner of Tarrant County.
That leaves Michelle as the only suspect, and her behavior in the coming weeks strengthens the argument for her guilt.
Very soon after the autopsy, Greg is cremated. Michelle rushed through this process.
There was no funeral. We were angry. We were really angry the way the situation was handled.
We had a slideshow for my dad. We had his ashes and this picture that my Aunt Michelle made of him. And we basically just memorialized who my dad was and remembered him for who he was.
While the family mourns, investigators dig into Greg and Michelle's financial records to see what they might reveal.
We thought that the financial records could perhaps lead us to some conclusions that would help us establish a motive. And things started jumping out very quickly.
The first thing I did was look at the closing statement for the house that they were supposed to close on the day after he was murdered. And that's when I started seeing a bunch of red flags. Well, the first red flag I noticed was she had submitted forged documents showing that they had approximately $145,000 in the bank account. On October 13th, the date of Greg Williams' death, they had $34,000 in their bank account, and they needed $91,000 for the down payment on the house that they were going to purchase. And there was not enough left to go move into this beautiful house that they had been planning on.
But Greg was making nearly $1 million a year. So where had it all gone?
They had exorbitant expenses, such as they were leasing their Mercedes. They were leasing the house that they lived in. They had $67,000 in credit card charges.
It became apparent the more we got into those records that Greg made the money and Michelle spent the money, and she did so with abandon.
Michelle just spent. She had no budget, so she could just go out and buy whatever she wanted. Greg let her handle all of the books, so he had no idea that she was spending all of that money.
Investigators also learned that the yogurt shop Greg bought for Michelle had never turned a profit.
It didn't make any money. It lost money. In fact,
Her nephews told me she would come in on a daily basis and take the cash out of the register. She used the yogurt shop as an ATM.
that's pretty good indication of a motive.
In my 30 years of working at different newspapers, I have never encountered a set of circumstances similar to the Michelle Williams case.
Michelle has already been charged for tampering with evidence, but based on this new information, her charges are upgraded to first-degree murder.
When she was arrested at the gym that she was working at and running with Mr. Wallace, who was a trainer. She was pretty stoic about the arrest. She didn't resist, she didn't run, she didn't burst into tears or anything very, very dramatic.
To me, it felt like justice had happened because she wasn't walking free.
Her bond was set pretty high, about $550,000. She had a lawyer who just sort of incidentally was at least a business client, if not a sometime partner of Greg's. He was hired by Michelle to represent her, and he filed a motion to reduce the bond. It was reduced to $85,000, and she was released, but she was released with an ankle monitor for all the good that did.
Coming up, but will justice be served? Or will a black widow get away with murder?
This was a circumstantial evidence case. Even DNA is circumstantial, but we didn't even have that.
After almost 3 months of investigation, Michelle Williams has been arrested for the murder of her husband, Greg. Police in Texas believe she shot him for the life insurance money after squandering their savings. And investigators learn Michelle didn't wait long before moving on to a new relationship.
A young man, 12 years Michelle's junior, by the name of Gene Wallace. And he became immediately Michelle's not only business partner, but lover. She began seeing him very quickly, within a matter of a couple of weeks after Greg's death.
The circumstantial evidence against Michelle seems to be growing by the day, but prosecutors fear a lack of physical evidence may prevent them from getting a conviction. So they decide to offer Michelle a plea deal instead.
The bargain was that Michelle was to plead guilty to tampering with evidence, a felony charge, and also deadly conduct, essentially recklessly discharging a firearm in someone's direction. And in exchange for her plea to those two charges, she was to get 18 years on the tampering with evidence charge, and she was to get 2 years on the deadly conduct charge.
Michelle accepts the offer, but as her sentencing date approaches, she throws prosecutors a curveball.
We were in the conference room at the DA's office, and they said, well, Michelle is pregnant. I said, well, that strikes me as something I need to see some proof of. Whereupon they produced a sonogram. She's pregnant not only with a baby, she's pregnant with 2 babies. She's pregnant with twins.
They agree to defer Michelle's sentencing until the babies are born, but she immediately breaks the conditions of her release.
She had asked to go to South Texas, down in the Corpus Christi area, I believe, and the probation officer said, no, you can't go that far away. So she figured a way to get her monitor off.
As the result, Michelle goes back to jail, and once again, her story changes.
Lo and behold, she's no more pregnant than I am. She has fabricated the entirety of the story just to buy time. We actually ultimately find the sonogram on the internet. It was all just a charade. I think it's fair to say that she has a very, very loose association with the truth.
The plea deal was wiped away because it was determined that she had lied to the court in making her plea.
She just had to push it further. And that was her undoing.
On September 22nd, 2014, Michelle Williams finally stands trial for murder. Her attorneys quickly unveil a new defense.
Michelle was trying to perhaps suggest to family and friends that someone else was responsible for Greg's death.
Michelle tried to set me up for the murder.
This was a story that kept on turning. It was like every time something would happen, it would be a new twist, a new turn. You never knew what would happen next.
The only possible motive seems to be revenge, but prosecutors quickly expose it as another lie.
One of her sons was the first witness that the state called to testify against Michelle.
Michelle asked me to call some friends and have them frame Kathy.
She tried to get her son to get a sweatshirt, take it to a field, put a gunshot in it, a gunshot hole, and then break into my car and put it in my car and call the police anonymously. And he would not do that.
It doesn't take the jury long to render their verdict.
Ms. Williams, if you would stand, please.
They found her guilty of murder and guilty of tampering with evidence.
On September 30th, 2014, Michelle is sentenced to 60 years for the murder of her husband and 10 more for tampering with evidence to cover it up.
We were all just really relieved. She wasn't going to be allowed to continue to be on this earth having hurt someone. In the end, she proved herself exactly what my gut feeling told me.
Greg Williams had trusted his second wife with his business, his family, and his fortune. But for Michelle, it would never be enough.
I think ultimately she killed him because she got caught stealing the money.
I believe that he told her that enough was enough, that Michelle concluded that the gravy train had come to a stop and that the golden goose was getting off. He had been betrayed.
Greg had such a big heart. He loved people, he loved his kids. The first anniversary of his death, Taylor and I took balloons and we went back to the house and we let the balloons go.
My dad has missed so many things in my life and continues to miss so many different things and milestones in my life. And I think I'm making my dad proud of me.